pour in, and it's nice to see just in terms of the success of the event, but also it's always nice to know that we're all sort of in this same boat together. so let's talk a little bit about that. What I have been hearing from faculty, like the overwhelming question that faculty are asking, is what is the best way to prepare for the fall, right? And I think I have an answer to that, a personal answer. But first, I want to talk about the way that people are thinking about approaching the fall that I think is maybe not quite the right way. What is the wrong way that people are thinking of this? So you have the conception is you have this face-to-face class, right? And you're going to have to do something called Hyflex, right? This term is all around now. You're going to Hyflex your course, right? And I use Hyflex here not necessarily as just the methodology, but as sort of the universe of concerns, right? So you're going to have to serve those in-class students. You're going to have to serve those students that are connecting in an online synchronous mode. And just unavoidably, you're going to have some students that need to connect asynchronously for either part of the semester or in some cases, maybe the whole semester. And you're going to want to serve those students simultaneously. And so we're going to get to Hyflex. We're going to get to this idea of Hyflex, but again, we're going to get there through I think a different route. So again, talking about the way that a lot of people conceptualize this shift, the idea is you have a face-to-face presentation, you have a class, the students do a bunch of stuff before the class. The stuff they do before the class maybe doesn't shift that much. It's stuff they do before the class. They can do that. They can do that at home, right? By definition. You have a face-to-face presentation, and then your class, you have a class discussion, and you kind of maybe have a rhythm, right? You go back and forth. Presentation, discussion, presentation, discussion. Maybe you do some class activities. Maybe it's active learning, right? So in the classroom, you're doing this presentation. Then you have the set of classroom activities. They're designed for classroom that you are doing. And then you go back and you kind of repeat the whole thing over, right? Lather, rinse, and repeat, right? And what happens when you look at it this way, right? The idea is that we're going to take this face-to-face class and we're going to somehow take the face-to-face class and we're going to repackage it in a way that it goes out to all these different audiences, right? But immediately when you start to think about that, it raises some questions, right? So one of the things that comes up is how will you possibly be able to watch both the class, right, in the Zoom session? You're going to be like looking at the chats coming up here, and you're going to be trying to teach to the class. And I think we've already had a little bit of experience like this, and it feels like it's going to just be overwhelming, right? There's going to be this idea: how can asynchronous students possibly get the classroom activity experience online, right? What happens if we go back into lockdown? I think after, at least in the U.S., as we look at this is kind of a U.S. context, we're looking at our numbers go up, and we're wondering, like, what happens if the face-to-face option disappears entirely for our grade level or our university? And just, it seems like it's too much. It seems like you're creating 3 different classes to pump out this way, and it's going to be 3 times as much work, right? But I think a lot of that stress, right, a lot of that sense of the challenge comes from approaching this and asking the wrong question, right? So again, this is the wrong question. I want to be clear. I think the wrong question that people are asking is, how do we create a face-to-face class while including online audiences, right? How do we create a face-to-face class while including online audiences, right? And I think there's a better question than this, right? I think this question approaches the problem from the wrong end. The better question is, how can we create an online experience in the fall that we can include our face-to-face students in, right? How can we create the online experience, right, that we are going to include the face-to-face students in? So what do I mean by this, right? What do I mean by this? We're going to get to Hyflex, right? But we're going to get there a slightly different way. Let's start with this. Let's start with something I call Zoom Flex, for lack of a better word. Kind of an annoying term, but we needed a term. So we're first going to do a flex that allows synchronous online with asynchronous online, and we're going to start it not by starting with the face-to-face class, but we're going to start it with a well-structured synchronous online presentation. We're going to start it in this case with the Zoom experience first, and obviously substitute Skype, substitute Teams, substitute whatever you want in this place. So this is something we've been doing at WSU, and I've done it in other contexts before. You structure a Zoom presentation and you present, right? And then you have the students go into breakouts. So far, so good. And one of the things that we've been doing is when they go out into breakouts, they work on a collaborative doc. So they have a bunch of answers that they have to answer together or separately. They can do it individually as well. And they go through and they apply what they've just learned in the presentation in answering these questions, right? And what happens is pretty neat, because when you come back to the class, I mean, what happens even before that is pretty neat, because you can actually see which groups are actually doing the work and which groups are not doing the work. And then you can jump in and intervene in the groups that are maybe getting a little off track. You kind of have this global view into your breakout rooms, so that you're not just teleporting into these breakout rooms blind. But when you come back, you're able to do this thing, and we kind of pull this a bit from Stephen Brookfield's work on discussion. You have this document that has what everybody thinks and what everybody has contributed so far, and it becomes a map. It becomes a map to facilitating a discussion, right? And so if you look at these arrows here between the Google Docs and the Zoom discussion, what you're going to do in the Zoom discussion is you're going to go and you're going to say, hey, Nikita, I noticed in the breakout doc that you said that you thought a good example of this concept was X. Could you expand? I'm getting a little excited here. Could you expand on that concept, right? And so Nikita gives her opinion of that, and then you say, Juan, I see that your group was having a similar conversation. Could you talk a little bit about that and how it relates to Nikita's point? And you just use that document as a map to facilitating the discussion. And this is going to work better in Zoom, because in Zoom you constantly have this problem where if it's an unstructured discussion, nobody wants to jump in. There's some latency, there's some delay. People have to mute, people have to unmute, you will be able, right? You will be able to. Sorry, I'm going to put the chat down a little low. I'm getting a little distracted by the chat here. So you will be able to facilitate that discussion, right, in a way that is more holistic and more democratic. And this is really, again, if you're looking for a theorist that has really informed this approach, Stephen Brookfield's Discussion as a Way of Teaching, that's your book, right? Okay, then you do quizzes, you do whatever, right? The first flex is to add an asynchronous option. Now, we go through and we record the Zoom presentation. Your asynchronous learner watches that. But at the point where the students have gone into breakouts, here's what the asynchronous learner does. They go into the Google Doc, and you can have them do this in a number of ways. One is just a simple task where they do exactly what those groups did. They fill out their ideas. Or you can have them do an expansion task. And this is something we've done successfully in some of our faculty training at WSU. You have people go through the document as the asynchronous learner and find the comments from the class that they find useful and explain why they find them useful. Or you have them critique the comments, right? And they're just going into that document. You use the same document. You're not setting up anything different. And this actually accords with the Hyflex. One of the pillars of Hyflex is reusability. And this actually kind of accords with that reusability principle. For the classroom discussion, you take the video of the class and you put it in a voice thread, and you just have them, or you put it in a discussion board, and you just have them, do their response to something that someone said in class, right? And then they just get back on the route and they do quizzes, and you go through this whole loop again, right? Now, what you'll notice here is adding asynchronous in this case was natural because online synchronous is already digital, right? So you had to do the online asynchronous, but it was digital, right? And all of the class artifacts are already digital. So they kind of natively flex into this method. So how do we go forward from here, right? Well, next we're going to add a face-to-face option. And to keep the diagram simple, I'll remove the last piece there. You kind of know this beginning. You do a Zoom presentation, but you're doing it in front of face-to-face students. right? So now you're kind of, instead of recording at home, you're recording it in front of the class, right? It's reusability again. But when the class activity comes, you have the in-class students work in the document. Now, if you can manage discussion and everything with some of the 6-foot distancing masking that people require, then the students go and they have their own groups and they write into the document with the people in the Zoom breakouts. If you can't, you restructure the discussion in such a way that they're using some of the chat tools and they're using the commenting tools to work with one another, even though they're in the class. We can also do this in a number of different ways, and I'll give you maybe a link to something that'll show you different ways you can do this depending on what situation you find yourself in the fall. But the key idea here is you're integrating them. Again, you're not integrating the online synchronous into the face-to-face, you're integrating the face-to-face into the online synchronous experience here, right? And then again, classroom and Zoom discussion. Now here is, I think, the brilliant part of this. So one of the things that I keep hearing from people, and it's a really important concern, is how am I going to balance the Zoom discussion in the class discussion? The class students will be right in front of me and I'll be kind of vibing on the class, and then I'll forget about the Zoom students, right? And they're going to feel like they're left out. Or I'll be talking to the Zoom students and the class is going to wonder, like, why did I drive all the way here to be in a face-to-face class when this person is just talking to a screen and not paying attention to the face-to-face students, right? This balance is something that I think faculty are quite rightly worried about. But you notice it goes away. It goes away here. It's not an issue here. Why is it not an issue? You look at those lines back and forth between the Google Docs. You're just doing the same thing you did in the Zoom session. You're saying, hey, Nikita, I noticed you said this. Now, is Nikita in the Zoom session? Is she in the class session? You don't necessarily even know, right? But because you're doing this poll structure, because you're structuring the discussion as do the pre-discussion document and then pull from the class, and because you're pulling from the document, you're pulling one time from the Zoom session. You're connecting that to comments the students are making in the class session, and it's not going to feel overwhelming at all. So again, adding face-to-face in this context was seamless because we integrated face-to-face students into the online synchronous methods, right? Not the other way around. This doesn't mean that you just do a Zoom session, right? I still really believe that you've got to try to figure out what you can do asynchronously. So this is the process that we're telling our faculty to follow. The first thing is do a bunch of asynchronous stuff around, and there are a bunch of sessions at this conference you can get into that will talk about this. Do a bunch of video intros and prompts, things that really connect with the students that are asynchronous, that they can watch outside of a class session. You introducing the course, telling them how excited you are for them to be there, telling them the ways in which you're going to support them, right? Discussion prompts that kind of, again, connect, but also get students to discuss things. Create some asynchronous explanatory video and audio, again, for all the students, so that we minimize some of the load on the synchronous session. So find some concepts, split them out, develop that explanatory video and audio, right? And this is work. I'm not going to lie. This is work. But you figure out how much of this you can do, right? Even just doing some of it, going to make a huge difference. And then the third step is to develop these Zoom-based or online synchronous. I say Zoom mainly because I just get sick of the long phrase online synchronous. But when I say Zoom, I mean online synchronous. It's like Kleenex now or something like that, right? So you develop Zoom-based engagement strategies that can flex both ways. We have we call this process here, connect, explain, engage. In our workshops. You can steal that if you want, but you're going to use the asynchronous video first to connect with the students, to show them your support. You're going to build some explanatory video, some explanatory text, maybe annotation, things like that. And then you're going to come up with an engagement plan that is built around online synchronous, right? And then is flexed each way. Now, if you are building a fully asynchronous course, that's great. Go ahead and do that. But what I'm saying is, if you're going to have online synchronous as part of your course, start with that as the center and flex both of these ways, right? So this is what this looks like. In practice, you go one direction, and then you Zoom flex, and then I'm not sure if I'm delayed a little bit here. Okay, and then you go to Hyflex, right? And so in the end, this solves. I think it has a native integration of synchronous online in face to face, so it's more inclusive, right? In that it's not going to leave one set of your students in an experience feeling like they're eating the sort of re microwaved meals of the class, right? Um, it's easy to flex to asynchronous activities for the bandwidth challenged, and maybe the space or environment challenge. And so I think it serves the aims of equity, and it retains coherence if restrictions should tighten, right? And ability to make use of the classroom if they should loosen, right? Both ways. And finally, it's just easier. It's just a lot easier to think about it this way. If you approach this way, I think it's not going to, I mean, it's going to be more work than a normal semester, but it's going to be a lot less work than the way I see some people kind of going after this. And I think you can get outcomes that are going to be just as good. So thank you for coming to this presentation. We're going to go to Q&A in a minute. I will say that on Twitter, I'm at Holden, and I did post right before this session. I posted a thread of links to some of the resources, including Brookfield's work, a video that is kind of similar to this presentation, if you want to share it with people, and a link to a blog that kind of goes into some of this in more detail. So if I don't get to your questions, please check that material out. They may have the answers there. And now I'm going to hand it back over to Matthew, and we're going to answer some questions.
Great, wonderful presentation, Mike. So a couple questions came in around this. What about sort of privacy and students who do not want to be recorded? Do you have any suggestions around that?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question, and I mean so there's a couple at the university level. There's a couple concerns already, right? The first thing is if you're going to reuse these materials, obviously you can't reuse students that are recorded without their permission. I think if you're doing anything that's synchronous online and you're recording students, you're going to have to work that out individually with students. One thing I would say is that I am a fan of letting, as long as students are engaged with the work, I'm a fan of letting them keep the cameras off. I know that flies in the face of what almost every faculty member is telling me they want. They want the cameras on. But a lot of student reticence to be recorded is not about their voice or not about the chat. It's about being recorded, sometimes in their bedroom, which just so what I would say is if you're structuring instruction in this way where the participation is recorded in things like Google Docs and where you're calling on people and they're responding, I would say my first step would be to let students keep their cameras off as long as they are participating in these other channels, and after that it's kind of negotiation.
Great. So I know there's a lot of us thinking about this, but the questions came up around how do you deal with equity issues, students who may not have access to computer, high-speed internet, Zoom, those kinds of resources that are required for this.
Yeah, so it's difficult, at some level. If you're going to offer online instruction, there's some base level of equipment, some base level of connectivity. One of the reasons why I really stress that asynchronous flex as important, because again, this is something I think a lot of faculty members contest. They say, oh, well, I get the first two. I get the face-to-face and the synchronous Zoom, but why do we need this asynchronous piece? I think the asynchronous piece, if you look at it, significantly reduces some of these equity issues for students. First of all, I think it's like, it's like it's maybe 0.7 gigabytes an hour to do a Zoom session, and then another 0.7 up if you have the cameras on. Whereas a recorded Zoom session is about 240 megabytes, right? So it can be buffered, right? Even if you have a lower even if you have a lower bandwidth, you can buffer a recorded session and you can watch that at home in a way that you wouldn't be able to do on your connection if it was synchronous. So that's thing number one. I think also because you can do it at the time of your choosing, students that may have access to access points, we've set up access points at our university where students can kind of come in, do their downloads, get out outside, just even sitting in the car. You can pick the time of your choosing and maybe get to a place where you're able to download some of that work. So for me, the asynchronous flex doesn't quite work like it normally does in Hyflex. In Hyflex, the asynchronous flex is really for students that have work scheduling issues. That's how it's traditionally used. Um, the asynchronous flex in our current environment is to deal with the students that may have those bandwidth issues and may have some home environment issues that make it difficult for them to work at a specific time from the home. And by allowing them the time shift, I think you mitigate a lot of those issues. Not all of them, but that's why I'm so insistent that people do have an asynchronous flex and not just the two synchronous.
What strategies or tools would you suggest for pedagogical variability, particularly maybe in working in problems in a quantitative class that maybe can't be discussion based?
Yeah, so quantitative is difficult in a number of ways, and the biggest difficulties we've hit at WSU are often just the notation itself, right? So, students have to, have to do math equations, and we don't want them all to have to learn, LaTeX or something to post those, right? But in general, I think if you think about a document that maybe has some math problems that students can work on together, I don't think that it's entirely different. It depends also on the course. If you have a statistics course, there's in the materials that are linked on my Twitter feed, we have an example of something called an unfolding case history, which is a structure by which you give students a problem and then that is sort of it's a realistic scenario where they have to apply their knowledge, and then you kind of have it unfold in steps, and the students kind of deal with it as it ramps up. I think you can also create some authentic scenarios around that. And then I do think that one of the things you'll do with math probably is you will push a bit of it off into asynchronous tools where the students practice do a lot of the practice of their skills maybe outside the class but with some formative feedback, and there are of course there's materials out there that you can get to help you do that.
In your experience, do you have any issues with students not understanding sort of the etiquette around the Zoom class or this mixed modality? Do you do anything to sort of address that or set things up at the beginning of class to make sure that students understand appropriate behavior for interactions?
Yeah, so I mainly teach faculty how to teach, and I did not have, I did not, I supported faculty in the, in the, the spring pivot or whatever we're calling it now. Yeah, this is a concern, right? But I think, again, it comes down to what are the ground rules and why are they there? What's appropriate and what's not. And one thing I would encourage people to do is to consider at the beginning of your class proposing what etiquette looks like, but you can also have your students develop some guidelines as well. And it's sometimes more powerful if you do that, right? So especially at the university level, but I think also at the high school level, you say to your students, what should we expect when we come into this space, and on the other hand, what's sort of problematic, right? And so the etiquette of, very quickly, I think you'll find that students are completely with you on the etiquette of muting microphones because they get annoyed too, right? When the microphones are not muted. I think you'll find that students have various opinions on having the cameras on. But that you can come to some sort of agreement with the students. So include the students in that, and set the ground rules. And I think the ground rules ultimately should be motivated by reasons that are by reasons that feel to the students motivated by real concerns, right? So students don't necessarily understand why, if they're doing it from their home, they can't, camera in their sweatpants or something like that. Well, if that's really your issue, I do think that you're going to have to come up with you're going to have to explain it in a way, and I think you would want to talk it over with the students too. I say, just in general, set ground rules at the beginning, involve students in that discussion, and then enforce the ground rules.
Excellent. There were a handful of questions just kind of around some of the logistics of, like, do you use the same Google Doc for them, or is it different docs for each different group? Are you monitoring the breakout sessions in the Zoom course, or are you looking at the Google Docs and monitoring kind of what's happening there?
Yeah, I can answer that really quickly. It depends on the course. So, for example, if you're not in a subject or activity that has what we call a free rider problem, if it's not going to be the case that other students are going to go and just look at what the other students are doing and then copy and paste that into their section, then just use one big document. It's easier for you. It's easier for the students. It's sometimes motivating to the students to see everybody else working, and it gets them on track. If you're dealing with something, we talked about this math scenario where students might do the math problems together in a group, in a document, then it might not be as useful to have one document, because you might get part of this free rider problem. You might see the students are too drawn to looking for the answers above before they try to work through them themselves. So in that case, you want to split it out into documents. I say in all cases, you create the documents, you have the links, and so you're able to easily click through them and see what's going on in each of those. And I only drop into the sessions when I see that there's a specific thing going on there that I want to address, whether that's things not being started or there is a misunderstanding about the nature of the assignment.
Excellent. I think we have time for this one quick last question. A lot of people are very curious what you use to create your slides today for the presentation.
I just hand drew them on a tablet. So I made the little cartoons on a tablet, and then I just pasted them into Google Docs. so my rudimentary drawing skills is what I use to make the slides.
Excellent. Well, I think we're out of time, but once again, I want to thank Mike for joining us.